The woods behind Alder Creek had always been quiet, too quiet for comfort. Locals said the trees there never swayed, even when storms tore through the valley. Birds avoided the canopy, and hunters spoke of strange echoes that didn't belong to any living creature. For decades, people had learned to steer clear of that stretch of wilderness, where time seemed to hold its breath. But on a humid August afternoon, a boy named Tommy Rourke broke the silence. Chasing after his runaway dog, he wandered deeper than anyone in Alder Creek had dared for years. That's when he saw it, a massive barn, its wood blackened with age and wrapped in tangled vines. Heavy iron chains crossed the entrance, bolted into place as if someone meant to keep something in, not out. He called for his dog, but only the sound of soft breathing answered, slow, labored, and too close. When Tommy leaned in to listen, a whisper brushed against the wood from inside. It wasn't clear. It wasn't even fully human. But it said his name. By nightfall, his parents found him trembling by the roadside, his eyes wide, his voice gone. The sheriff called it shock, but the old people of Alder Creek said it had started again, the curse that began generations ago, when a man locked his daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters away in that barn, claiming they were too perfect to be touched by the outside world. Now, after almost a century, the barn was awake again. And something inside it had remembered the taste of air. The discovery of the barn began with something so ordinary, no one could have imagined the horror it would uncover. It was late afternoon, the kind where the air hangs thick with humidity, and the only sound is the buzz of cicadas echoing through the trees. Tommy Rourke, a 12-year-old boy from Alder Creek, had gone into the woods chasing his dog, Scout. The dog had darted off after a rabbit, tail high, and Tommy, barefoot and laughing, had followed without realizing how far he had gone. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. The sunlight dimmed as the trees grew denser, their trunks warped and split like scars in the earth. There was a smell too, something damp and faintly metallic, like rust and decay. After nearly an hour of calling out for Scout, Tommy came to a clearing that looked unnatural, as if the forest itself had been pushed aside long ago and never dared to grow back. In the center stood a structure, massive and dark, leaning slightly to one side. The barn was older than anything Tommy had ever seen, its boards rotted and eaten through by time. But what caught his attention weren't the broken windows or the caved-in roof. It was the chains. Thick iron chains stretched across the double doors, bolted into the wood so tightly they had left deep scars in the grain. Someone had locked the barn from the outside, wrapping the chains again and again, and sealing them with a padlock the size of a man's fist. Tommy thought maybe it was a storage barn, something abandoned from before the town was founded. But then he noticed the marks on the ground, footprints, dozens of them, half sunk in the mud. Some were small, like a child's. Others were bare, wide, and unfamiliar. He crouched to look closer when he heard the first sound from inside. It wasn't loud. Just a slow, dragging movement, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. He froze. His heart thudded against his ribs. Then came another sound, a low moan, soft and drawn out, that made his skin crawl. For a long moment, he stood still, staring at the chained doors, unable to breathe. Then, faintly, through the cracks of the wood, something whispered. It wasn't a word at first, more a hiss, a sigh pushed through parched lips. But as the sound came again, clearer this time, Tommy felt his blood turn cold. It was his name. Someone or something inside the barn had whispered his name. Tommy stood frozen in front of the chained barn, every nerve in his body on edge. The woods around him had gone silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Even the cicadas, constant companions of summer, had stopped their rhythmic hum. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the doors, waiting for another sound. Then it came, a noise that didn't belong to any animal or human he knew. It began as a faint whimper, like someone gasping for air after a long time underwater. But as it grew louder, it shifted, twisting into something raw and uneven, half scream and half prayer. The sound clawed through the cracks in the barn's wooden planks, sharp and trembling, echoing in the stillness like a warning. Tommy stumbled backward, his hands shaking. He tried to tell himself it was an animal trapped inside, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But deep down, he knew no creature made a sound like that. There was pain in it, centuries of it, and something else too, something that felt aware. It wasn't calling for help, it was calling him. The chains on the door rattled once, just a tiny movement, as if something inside had brushed against them. The metal groaned, and Tommy's pulse spiked. His mouth went dry, and the urge to run battled against a strange pull to stay and listen. He took one hesitant step closer, his breath fogging in the thick air. "Hello," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The sound that followed made him wish he'd never spoken. It wasn't a reply, not in words, but in tone. It was mocking, almost mimicking his whisper back at him. The same syllables, the same soft tremor, repeated from within the darkness. "Hello." His heart stopped for a moment. The voice was high and frail, like a woman's, but something about it was wrong. It echoed in layers, as if more than one mouth had spoken at once, their tones overlapping into an eerie chorus. Tommy stumbled backward, tripping over a root, his eyes never leaving the barn. The air around him had changed, heavier now, pressing down on his chest. He could hear breathing from behind the doors, slow and shallow, like someone standing just inches away. Then came the scream, sudden, sharp, and piercing enough to split through the trees. It was so loud that flocks of birds burst from the treetops, scattering into the fading sky. The sound seemed to shake the earth itself, echoing through the forest before dying into silence once more. Tommy ran. He didn't look back, not once. But long after he left the woods behind, the sound followed him, echoing faintly in his ears, a reminder that something inside that barn had awakened, and it knew his name. By the time Tommy's parents found him at the edge of the woods, he was trembling so violently that he couldn't speak. His face was pale, streaked with tears and dirt, and his shoes were missing. When his mother asked what had happened, he only shook his head and pointed back toward the forest, his lips forming a single word that never fully came out: barn. The sheriff, an older man named Clay Harlan, arrived shortly after dusk. He'd served Alder Creek his whole life and had heard every kind of story these woods could hold, but when Tommy's father mentioned the barn, Clay's expression changed. The color drained from his face, and his jaw tightened in a way that made the boy's parents uneasy. He told them to keep Tommy inside, to make sure he didn't go near those woods again. When the mother asked why, the sheriff simply said, "Because some things back there were meant to stay buried." Word spread quickly through the small town, as it always did. Some said the boy had seen ghosts, others claimed it was just wild animals that had frightened him. But among the older residents, those who still remembered whispers from their grandparents, the talk was quieter and heavier. They knew about the family that had once lived in those woods, the ones who never came to town, who kept to themselves, and who built that barn long before Alder Creek even had a name. They were said to be devout, almost fanatically so, believing that the world outside was impure and that only their bloodline carried the true spirit of God. When the Civil War ended and the town began to grow, the family sealed themselves away. People assumed they'd moved or died, but no bodies were ever found. Only silence remained where their house once stood, and later, the barn that became their tomb. Sheriff Clay remembered being a child when his own grandfather warned him never to go past the old creek bed. The man had said there were voices in the woods, voices that mimicked people you loved. Clay hadn't believed him then, but when he went out years later to investigate a missing trapper and saw that same barn chained shut with rusted iron, he hadn't dared to open it. Now, decades later, hearing that a boy had stumbled upon it again filled him with the same cold dread. He didn't tell the parents what he knew. Instead, he ordered the area sealed off and filed no report. But that night, as he sat alone in his office, the phone rang once, though no one was on the other end. Only a faint sound, thin and distant, like a woman's voice whispering through static, repeating the same name, Tommy. 2 weeks after the incident in the woods, Alder Creek began to buzz again, this time with talk of the local historian, Margaret Ellison. She was a quiet woman in her 50s, known for keeping the past alive through brittle photographs and dusty records. Margaret had heard about Tommy's discovery and Sheriff Clay's unusual reaction. That night, curiosity got the better of her. She went to the town archive, a small, dimly lit room behind the library, and began digging through boxes marked pre-settlement families. Most of the papers were faded, the ink barely legible, but after hours of searching, she found something strange, an envelope dated 1891 with no sender. Inside were a dozen photographs, each showing the same thing: a young woman standing in front of a wooden barn, her hands clasped tightly in front of her dress, her eyes fixed directly on the camera. The photos spanned decades, judging by the changing fashions, the early ones with corsets and lace, the later ones with rough homespun dresses. But the woman never seemed to age. Her face remained eerily identical in each picture, the same hollow cheeks, the same wide, unblinking eyes. The only difference was the background. In some, the barn behind her looked new and well kept; in others, it had begun to rot, its boards blackening with time. Margaret felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as she spread the photographs across the table. The handwriting on the back of each one was faint but readable. The first said, *Eleanor, 1891. The next, *Eleanor, 1912. Then, *Eleanor, 1938. By the last, dated *Eleanor, 1974, Margaret could no longer convince herself that these were just descendants with the same name. She leaned closer, scanning the fine details, and noticed something she hadn't at first: the shadow that appeared in every image. Behind the woman, half hidden in the dark of the barn doorway, a figure stood watching. Always the same outline, always the same height, as if the person had never moved through time at all. Margaret felt her heart quicken. She knew she should stop, but instead she pulled the old property maps from a nearby drawer. There, on the outskirts of Alder Creek, the same patch of forest appeared unlabeled, but marked faintly with an X and the name Rourke Homestead. Her fingers trembled as she traced the line of the creek that still ran there. The barn, she realized, wasn't just some abandoned structure. It was the last remnant of a family that had never left. That night, Margaret developed copies of the photographs and tucked them into a folder labeled the Eleanor line. She didn't notice the faint smudge on one print until later. On the glass pane of the photo itself, just beside the woman's face, a small fingerprint pressed into the film from the asterisk inside. The leather-bound journal was found purely by accident, buried beneath a pile of rotted hay inside an old storage shed behind the abandoned church on the edge of Alder Creek. A group of teenagers exploring the property stumbled across it when the floorboards gave way beneath them. The book was blackened by age, its cover warped and water-damaged, but the clasp still held tight. When they brought it to Margaret Ellison a few days later, she recognized the initials embossed faintly on the front, **J**. She had seen those letters before, etched into one of the wooden beams in the old property records, *Jacob Rourke*, the man who had owned the land where the barn now stood. Margaret opened the journal with trembling hands. The first few pages were filled with scripture, at least that's what it appeared to be, but the writing became darker, stranger, the deeper she read. Jacob wrote of his belief that the world outside his family had been corrupted, that the blood of strangers carried sin, disease, and decay. He spoke of a vision, of a voice that had come to him one night while he prayed in the barn. The voice, he said, was that of God himself, commanding him to preserve purity at all costs. Jacob described sealing his family away from the world, beginning with his wife and daughters. Our line must remain unbroken, untouched by outsiders, one passage read, for in our blood lies the first light, unspoiled by time. As the entries went on, the language shifted from religious fervor to madness. He wrote of cleansing rituals, of births that should never have been and deaths that were necessary to keep the line pure. Each page reeked of fanaticism and decay, the ink smeared with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Toward the end, the handwriting grew frantic, letters scrawled so violently they tore through the paper. Jacob wrote of a curse, that the voice had changed, whispering no longer in God's tone but in something older, something that demanded payment. "They are not mine anymore," the final entry read. "The women see with eyes that are not their own. They hear me even when I am silent. I sealed the doors, but they still call my name through the walls. I can't tell if it's prayer or hunger." The last page was dated 1893, 2 years after the earliest photograph of Eleanor had been taken. Margaret sat in her study long after midnight, reading the final line over and over again. Outside her window, the wind pressed against the glass, carrying with it a faint echo that almost sounded like whispering, soft, rhythmic, and repeating the same word written dozens of times in the margins of the journal, *pure. The night Margaret Ellison disappeared, Alder Creek was swallowed by fog so thick it muffled every sound. She had been restless for days after discovering Jacob Rourke's journal, her once orderly home now buried beneath stacks of papers, old maps, and the eerie photographs of the woman called Eleanor. Those close to her said she had stopped eating, sleeping only in short bursts, muttering about bloodlines that never ended and voices that remembered her name. On the evening of her disappearance, she called Sheriff Clay Harlan, her voice trembling, telling him she had found something new, something that proved the Rourke family never truly died out. Before Clay could ask what she meant, the line went dead, replaced by a faint, distant humming, a sound like wind passing through hollow wood. When Clay arrived at her home half an hour later, her front door was open. The lights were still on, and a kettle had boiled itself dry on the stove, its bottom scorched black. Her notes were scattered across the table, pages torn and covered with markings, symbols that weren't in any language Clay recognized. The folder labeled the Eleanor line lay open beside an old photograph. In the picture, Margaret herself appeared reflected in the barn's broken window, though she swore she had never been there. Her purse was still on the counter, her car parked out front, keys in the ignition. The only thing missing was her camera. The sheriff organized a search party that same night. They scoured the woods until dawn, calling her name, following faint tracks that led toward the creek. The trail ended abruptly in the clearing where the old barn stood. The chains on the doors had been disturbed, fresh mud clinging to the metal. Near the base of the door, half buried in the dirt, was Margaret's camera, cracked, the film compartment open. The sheriff didn't touch it. He said it was better left for evidence, but no one from the state ever came to collect it. 2 days later, the film was developed by the deputy. Most of the photos were blurred, but one image was clear enough to send a chill through everyone who saw it. It showed the interior of the barn, dark, decayed, and filled with shadows. In the center stood several figures, thin and pale, their eyes reflecting light like an animal's caught in a beam. In the corner, Margaret was visible, her face turned toward the camera, mouth open as if mid-scream. Behind her, a hand rested on her shoulder, long, gray, and unmistakably human. After that, the case went cold. Her house was sealed, her research stored away. But late at night, when the fog rolled down from the hills, people still claimed they could hear a woman's voice whispering from the woods, repeating softly, "I found them." The storm came without warning, rolling in over Alder Creek like a living thing. The air grew heavy hours before the first flash of lightning tore through the sky, but by then, it was too late for anyone to prepare. The townspeople said they hadn't seen weather like that in decades. The wind howled through the streets, bending trees until their trunks cracked, and rain fell in thick, violent sheets that blurred the world into gray. Power lines snapped one after another, plunging the town into darkness. Out near the woods, the storm was even worse. The lightning struck so close it lit up the forest floor, revealing flashes of movement between the trees, shapes too tall and too still to be animals. Sheriff Clay Harlan sat alone in his truck near the old creek road, watching the rain hammer against his windshield. He had come to check the perimeter after the disappearance of Margaret Ellison, convinced that whatever she'd been searching for had something to do with the Rourke barn. The area had been taped off, but the storm had ripped the warnings away like paper. When the wind shifted, Clay thought he heard something beneath the thunder, a low groan, metal straining under pressure. Then came the unmistakable sound of chains snapping. He stepped out into the storm, flashlight cutting through the sheets of rain, and saw it, the barn, standing at the far end of the clearing, its doors trembling against the wind. The heavy iron chains that had sealed it for generations were breaking, one by one, pulled apart by something stronger than the storm itself. Clay waded through the mud, shouting for backup, but his radio crackled uselessly in the rain. Another bolt of lightning struck nearby, and for an instant, the entire structure was bathed in white light. Through the cracks in the wood, he saw movement, shadows shifting in slow, unnatural rhythm. The air around the barn seemed to pulse, the walls groaning as if they were breathing. He stopped short when a voice rose from inside, faint but unmistakable, a woman's voice, humming an old tune that no one had sung in Alder Creek for over a century. It was the same lullaby Jacob Rourke had mentioned in his journal, the one he said his daughters sang when they couldn't sleep. Clay's flashlight flickered and went out. The door hinges shrieked as the last chain fell to the ground, swallowed by mud. The barn doors creaked open, not from the wind but from within. The sheriff stumbled backward, raising his gun though he didn't know what he was aiming at. Then came the smell, rot and something sweet, like wilted flowers and decay. The storm drowned out the rest, thunder roaring as the doors swung wide, and for a brief moment before everything went black, Clay saw figures stepping forward, pale and slow, their faces expressionless and wrong, as if they had been waiting all this time for the sky to break. In the days that followed the storm, Alder Creek was unrecognizable. Trees lay scattered across the roads, roofs were torn open, and the power grid remained dead for nearly a week. Yet, it wasn't the damage that kept people awake at night, it was what began happening after the storm had passed. At first, only a few residents mentioned seeing things out by the tree line, pale figures moving between the trunks, gliding instead of walking, vanishing when lights were shone in their direction. Most dismissed it as exhaustion or tricks of the fog that hung low over the valley. But then came the voices. They began softly, just before dawn, distant humming, old lullabies that no one could place. Dogs refused to go outside. Children woke screaming, claiming a woman had been watching them through the window, whispering their names. By the third night, the sightings were constant. A trucker driving the back road swore he saw a group of women standing in the rain near the creek, their hair matted, their eyes catching the headlights like glass. He slowed, thinking they were survivors needing help, but when he stepped out, they were gone, no footprints, no sound, only the smell of wet earth and something faintly metallic. He didn't tell anyone until the next day, when he found deep scratches along the side of his truck, shaped like fingernail marks. Sheriff Clay Harlan was never seen again after the storm, but his truck was found half buried in the mud near the barn clearing. Inside was his badge, his gun, and a voice recorder. The final entry was distorted by rain, but one part was clear. Clay's voice whispered, hoarse and panicked, "They're singing. Dear God, they're still singing." That was the night people began locking their doors early and drawing their curtains tight. The fog lingered longer than it should have, thick enough to dull the moonlight. Every so often, neighbors would hear slow footsteps on gravel or the faint tapping of fingers on glass, but when they looked, nothing was there. Then the power finally came back, and with it, the town's streetlights flickered to life. On the first night of light, dozens of people saw the same thing. Down by the edge of the woods, half hidden in the mist, a line of women stood facing the town. Their dresses were torn, their skin pale as bone, their eyes reflecting the lamplight in a dull, silver glow. When one man shouted at them, they turned in unison and walked back into the forest. The humming continued until sunrise. After that, Alder Creek changed forever. People spoke in whispers, and no one went near the woods again. But sometimes, on windless nights, when everything was too still, the lullaby returned, faint but clear, rising from the direction of the barn. When the federal team finally arrived in Alder Creek, months had already passed since the storm, and most of the townspeople had learned to pretend nothing had happened. The forest had started to grow back, the barn stood silent again, and no one dared to go near it. Still, the disappearances couldn't be ignored, 5 in total, including Sheriff Clay Harlan and Margaret Ellison. The investigators from the State Forensic Division came quietly, without press or warning. They brought ground-penetrating radar, excavation tools, and equipment for DNA analysis. Their goal was simple: to confirm whether the Rourke family legends were real. They began digging near the barn, where the soil was unusually soft and uneven, as if it had been disturbed repeatedly over the years. Within hours, they found the first set of remains. At first, they assumed it was just one body, but as the excavation deepened, bones emerged layer after layer, skulls, ribs, and vertebrae, all tangled together, as though generations had been buried in the same pit. The team uncovered dozens of skeletons, some small like children, others adult but malformed. What unsettled them most was their similarity. Every skull looked nearly identical, every jawline and cheekbone shaped the same, as if they belonged to copies of a single person. The team lead, Dr. Avery, ordered DNA testing to confirm what she already feared. When the results came back, the readings were unlike anything the lab had ever seen. The genetic variation between individuals was almost non-existent. Every sample traced back to the same bloodline, repeating generation after generation, the code so compressed it began to collapse upon itself. The scientists said such uniformity shouldn't be possible in living humans. It was as if time had folded the same family over itself until there was nothing left but a perfect genetic echo. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Some bones showed signs of deformity, elongated limbs, fused joints, teeth grown into irregular patterns. Others bore scratches, deep grooves that looked like claw marks, though no animal bones were found nearby. A few remains had their skulls caved in, deliberate and clean, as if someone had ended them swiftly. Dr. Avery stopped the dig after uncovering what appeared to be a recent burial, a woman's skeleton, her bones still pale and fresh compared to the others. Clutched in her hand was a rusted piece of chain, the same kind that once sealed the barn doors. The final DNA test confirmed what no one wanted to believe: every skeleton in that ground, from the oldest to the newest, shared not only the same ancestry but nearly the same genome. It wasn't a family buried there. It was one person, replicated, relived, and remade for over a century. Weeks after the excavation ended, the evidence from Alder Creek was packed away into sealed crates, labeled as restricted, and sent to a government facility hours away. The town fell silent again, its people unwilling to speak of what had been uncovered. Only one item from the site never made it into official records: a small tape recorder found among Sheriff Clay Harlan's belongings. The device was damaged, waterlogged, but a single recording remained intact. It was turned over to Dr. Avery, who played it in a locked room with the lights dimmed and the blinds drawn. The tape began with static, soft and uneven, before a woman's voice came through, whispering in a strained, broken tone. Her words were almost drowned by the background noise, but one phrase repeated clearly enough to chill anyone who heard it: "He never let us leave. He said the world would never understand us." Dr. Avery replayed it several times, studying the cadence of the voice. It was too clear to be a ghostly echo and too human to be an old recording artifact. There was breathing, pauses, and even the faint creak of floorboards beneath her, as though the speaker was standing in a confined space. When the tape continued, the voice grew frantic, shifting from a whisper to a desperate plea. "The door won't open," she said. "He's gone, but the air still moves. We're still here. We're still here." After that, the recording cut into a high-pitched whine before falling silent. For a moment, Dr. Avery thought the tape had ended, but then came another sound, soft at first, like someone humming a lullaby. It was the same melody the sheriff had mentioned in his final log, the song Jacob Rourke had written in his journal more than a century earlier. The hum continued for several minutes, joined gradually by other voices, at least half a dozen, blending together, rising and falling in uneven rhythm. It wasn't harmonious. It sounded wrong, layered and distorted, as though the same woman were singing through multiple mouths. Then, abruptly, a thud shook the recorder, followed by slow, dragging footsteps moving closer. The final thing captured was a faint breath against the microphone, followed by a whisper that seemed almost aware of being heard: "You opened the door. We can see you now." The tape ended there, and no one who listened to it ever dared play it again. The recorder was sealed in evidence storage, but rumors spread that even inside the vault, it would occasionally turn itself on in the middle of the night, the sound of that same lullaby faintly bleeding through the walls, echoing the curse of a family that had never been allowed to die.